In the silence of a July afternoon in the year 1900, just beyond the gates of a neoclassical palace gleaming white against the Lombard sky, an anarchist's bullet shattered more than a king's heart. It extinguished forever the intimate relationship between Italy's royal house of Savoy and their beloved Villa Real of Monza, transforming a summer retreat built for joy into a monument of abandonment. A ghost palace whose empty halls would echo with the footsteps of no monarch for the next 46 years, until the dynasty itself collapsed under the weight of choices made in darkness, complicity with fascism, and the final, irrevocable judgment of a people who voted to end a 1,000-year lineage and banish their kings into permanent exile, leaving behind not just one abandoned palace but an entire architecture of power rendered suddenly obsolete. And yet to understand how a building commissioned by Habsburg emperors could become the unwitting stage for Italian tragedy, how rooms designed for enlightened entertainment could be forsaken after a single night of violence, how corridors that once rang with the laughter of queens could stand silent for nearly half a century while outside its walls the nation it represented descended into dictatorship, world war, and revolutionary transformation. We must travel back to 1777, to the court of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, perhaps the most formidable woman in 18th-century Europe, who ruled the sprawling Habsburg domains with an iron will wrapped in maternal concern, and who understood that power, to be maintained, must be housed in splendor, that authority requires architectural expression, that an empire's legitimacy is written not just in treaties and battle victories but in the stones of palaces, in the symmetry of gardens, in the calculated magnificence of buildings that announce to all who behold them, here resides not merely wealth, but civilization itself. And so when Maria Theresa looked toward her Italian possessions, the Duchy of Milan, acquired through war and dynastic marriage, rich in silk production and agricultural wealth, strategically positioned between Austria and the always troublesome states of the Italian peninsula, and considered the needs of her favorite son, Archduke Ferdinand, whom she had appointed governor of these territories, she saw not just a political problem requiring a bureaucratic solution but an opportunity to make visible, in brick and marble, the permanence and enlightened nature of Habsburg rule. And the site she chose, or rather that her advisors recommended and she approved, was Monza, a small city 15 kilometers from Milan, known since Roman times for the salubrity of its air, the gentle landscape of its countryside, positioned symbolically on the road between Milan and Vienna, thus serving as a physical link between the imperial capital and its Italian domains, a place where Ferdinand could retreat from the summer heat of Milan, entertain visiting nobility, manage his extensive art collections, cultivate his passion for botany, and demonstrate through architectural patronage the cultural sophistication that Habsburg rule brought to Italy. And for the architect of this demonstration Maria Theresa turned to Giuseppe Piermarini, the preeminent neoclassical designer in Lombardy, a man who had trained under the great Luigi Vanvitelli at Caserta and who understood implicitly that architecture was never merely about shelter or even beauty but about the communication of ideas, the materialization of power relationships, the creation of spaces that would shape how people moved, thought, felt, and understood their place in the social hierarchy. And Piermarini approached his commission with the sober rationality that characterized the best of Enlightenment architecture, rejecting the exuberant Baroque ornamentation of the previous generation in favor of clean lines, logical proportions, symmetrical arrangements, a vocabulary of columns and pediments derived from classical antiquity but deployed with a restraint that spoke of reason rather than emotion, of order rather than passion. And the design he produced between 1777 and 1780, executed with astonishing speed considering its scale, 700 rooms, 22,000 square meters of floor space, a vast U-shaped main block with service wings extending forward to define a grand courtyard, drew direct inspiration from Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna, replicating its inverted U-plan to achieve both imposing visual impact and practical functionality, with the central block reserved for public receptions and ceremonial occasions, the side wings containing private apartments for the Archduke and his household, and the forward-projecting pavilions accommodating service functions, kitchens, laundries, stables, all the mechanical necessities of palace life discreetly contained in spaces that would be invisible to aristocratic visitors approaching the main entrance. And yet Piermarini departed from Schönbrunn in one crucial respect: instead of orienting the main facade to the south to maximize solar warmth and natural light, he positioned the Villa Real facing east and west, perhaps to ensure cooler temperatures during the brutal Italian summers, perhaps to symbolically orient the garden facade toward Vienna, toward the imperial capital that legitimized Ferdinand's authority, toward the source of power that made this entire magnificent enterprise possible, and the resulting palace, completed in a mere 3 years of intensive construction requiring hundreds of laborers whose names have vanished from history, whose backs bent under the weight of stone blocks quarried in distant mountains, whose hands shaped the decorative elements that would forever bear the attribution only of the famous artists who designed them, the stucco work of Giocondo Albertalli, the frescoes of Giuseppe Lavati and Giulio Traballisi, the marquetry floors and furniture of Giuseppe Maggiolini, stood as a testament not merely to Habsburg wealth but to the rational principles of enlightened absolutism, to the idea that a wise ruler, properly educated, advised by philosophers and artists, could through the instrument of beautiful architecture bring prosperity and culture to his subjects, and Archduke Ferdinand, sickly, intellectual, genuinely interested in the arts and sciences, seemed at first the embodiment of this ideal, filling his new palace with collections of paintings and sculpture, establishing botanical gardens where exotic species from around the world could be cultivated and studied, hosting gatherings where scientists and artists mingled with nobility in a model of enlightened sociability, and for 2 decades the Villa Real functioned precisely as Maria Theresa had envisioned, a center of refined civilization in Italy, a demonstration through architecture and patronage that Habsburg rule meant progress, culture, and sophisticated governance. Until 1796, when the French revolutionary armies under a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte swept into Italy, shattering the old order, driving the Austrians from Milan, and transforming the Villa Real, almost overnight, from a symbol of Habsburg permanence into a trophy of French conquest, a palace whose very existence now mocked the pretensions of the rulers who had built it. For what good were 700 rooms, what protection did rational neoclassical symmetry provide against the cannons and revolutionary fervor of the French Republic, and Napoleon, with his genius for symbolic appropriation, immediately grasped the value of such buildings, understanding that power requires not just military victory but theatrical presentation, and when he established his stepson Eugene de Beauharnais as viceroy of the new Napoleonic Kingdom of Italy in 1805, he directed that the Villa Real should serve as the vice-regal residence, should be expanded and modernized to properly represent French authority, should demonstrate through its magnificence that the new order would exceed the old not just in military might but in cultural sophistication and architectural ambition, and so Beauharnais commissioned the architect Luigi Canonica to improve and extend the complex, adding a court theatre in the north wing, enlarging the gardens, and most significantly creating between 1806 and 1808 the vast Parco di Monza, an enclosed hunting park of such enormous scale, 14 kilometers of wall surrounding forests, meadows, streams, artificial lakes, classical temples, rustic cottages, an entire artificial landscape designed to provide both recreation and picturesque scenery, that it remains to this day one of the largest walled parks in Europe, a landscape where the royal hunt, that ancient aristocratic prerogative, could be conducted with suitable grandeur, where visiting dignitaries could be impressed not merely by the palace architecture but by the vast extent of territory controlled and shaped by its owner, and for a brief moment, during the years of Napoleon's dominance over Europe, the Villa Real thrived as never before, hosting lavish entertainments, military reviews, diplomatic receptions, serving as the stage for Beauharnais' performance of viceregal authority, until 1814 when Napoleon's empire collapsed, when the French armies retreated, when the Congress of Vienna redrew the map of Europe and restored, with modifications, the pre-revolutionary order, and Austria, victorious in the great coalition that had finally defeated Bonaparte, reclaimed Lombardy, not as an independent duchy but as part of the new kingdom of Lombardy-Venetia, a Habsburg possession administered directly from Vienna, and the Villa Real once again became a Habsburg residence, now occupied by Archduke Rainer Joseph of Austria, a man whose passion for botany transformed the palace gardens into a living laboratory, who in 1819 established within the park a school to train professional gardeners for all the imperial residences, who worked with architect Giacomo Tazzini to modernize the interior apartments, updating plumbing, improving floors, adding refined decorative touches that reflected the increasingly refined tastes of the early 19th century, and for 3 decades under Rainer's stewardship the Villa Real existed in a kind of suspended prosperity, no longer the center of viceregal power as it had been under Beauharnais, but a comfortable retreat where a Habsburg archduke could pursue his horticultural interests, maintain the family's visible presence in Lombardy, and demonstrate through continued patronage and careful maintenance that Austrian rule, though resented by many Italian nationalists, brought stability, culture, and economic benefits, until 1848 when revolution exploded across Europe, when Italians in Milan rose up against Austrian authority in the famous 5 Days Uprising, when Archduke Rainer hastily departed, when the villa briefly served as a headquarters for Marshal Radetzky, the aging Austrian military commander who would brutally suppress the Italian rebellions, and though the Habsburgs maintained nominal control over Lombardy for another decade, the events of 1848 marked a turning point, revealed the fundamental instability of Austrian rule in Italy, exposed the fact that no amount of architectural magnificence, no gardens however scientifically cultivated, no demonstrations of enlightened governance could overcome the growing Italian conviction that they should govern themselves, that foreign rulers, however cultivated, were still foreign, still illegitimate, and when in 1859 France allied with the Kingdom of Sardinia to drive Austria from Italy, when the Second Italian War of Independence resulted in Lombardy's annexation to what would become the Kingdom of Italy, the Villa Reale faced yet another transformation, passed from Habsburg to Savoy ownership, became a possession of that ancient dynasty which, through a combination of military skill, diplomatic cunning, and historical circumstance, found itself in 1861 presiding over a newly unified Italian nation, and Victor Emmanuel II, the first king of Italy, surveying his dramatically expanded domains, for the House of Savoy had ruled merely Piedmont and Sardinia, now suddenly claimed sovereignty over the entire peninsula from the Alps to Sicily, understood that his family needed to establish visible authority throughout these territories, needed to occupy the palaces that previous rulers had built, needed to transform Habsburg residences into Savoy residences, needed to write over the architectural legacy of Austria with a new narrative of Italian national unity under Savoy leadership, and so in 1868, when Victor Emmanuel's son Umberto married Princess Margherita of Savoy, the king gifted the Villa Reale to the young couple as a wedding present, a gesture of dynastic continuity, a signal that the Savoys would continue the tradition of royal residence in Monza, would maintain the palace and its gardens, would use this architecture to project their authority over northern Italy. And Umberto and Margherita, young, energetic, genuinely popular in a way that Victor Emmanuel with his gruff military manner never quite achieved, embraced the villa enthusiastically, commissioned modernization works by architects Achille Magnoni d'Intignano and Luigi Tarantola to update the aging neoclassical interiors to suit late 19th century tastes, introducing new furnishings, improving gas lighting, eventually installing electricity, adding modern plumbing and heating systems, all the technological improvements that were transforming palace life in the industrial age, and for 3 decades. Umberto and Margherita used the Villa Reale as their summer residence, a retreat from the protocols and pressures of the Quirinal Palace in Rome, a place where they could entertain in relative informality, where Umberto could indulge his military interests. The park provided excellent space for troop reviews and military exercises, and where Margherita, intelligent, cultured, interested in the arts, could cultivate her image as the ideal modern queen, beautiful but not frivolous, regal but accessible, devoted to charitable works while maintaining appropriate splendor, and the Villa Reale during these years became not merely a palace but a symbol, appearing in newspapers and illustrated magazines, its gardens opened occasionally for public events, its very existence serving as evidence that the Savoy monarchy was legitimate, stable, permanent, that Italy had successfully transitioned from a collection of squabbling states to a proper nation with a proper king in a proper palace. And then on the evening of July 29, 1900, King Umberto I, having spent a pleasant day at the villa, attended an evening sporting event in Monza organized by the local gymnastics society, 40E Liberi, and as his carriage departed the event, as he waved to the crowd gathered to see their king, an Italian anarchist named Gaetano Bresci, who had traveled from Paterson, New Jersey specifically to commit this act, who carried a revolver purchased in America, who was motivated by a toxic mixture of anarchist ideology and personal rage against the monarchy's responsibility for violent suppression of labor protests, stepped forward and fired 4 shots at point-blank range, and Umberto I, who had survived one previous assassination attempt, who had reigned for 22 years, who had presided over Italy's troubled transition to industrialization and its disastrous colonial adventures, died almost immediately, and his death, shocking in its suddenness, traumatic in its violence, marked not just the end of a reign but the effective end of the Villa Real as a functioning royal residence. For his son, the new King Victor Emmanuel III, traumatized by his father's murder, unable or unwilling to separate the palace from the assassination that had occurred just beyond its gates, declared that he would never again stay in Monza, ordered the villa closed, directed that its furnishings be removed and transferred to the Quirinal in Rome, and for the next 34 years the Villa Real stood largely abandoned, its 700 rooms empty, its gardens maintained by a skeleton staff, its architectural splendor serving no purpose, a monument not to royal power but to royal grief, to the sudden fragility of dynasties, to the way violence can transform a beloved retreat into a place too painful to inhabit, and Victor Emmanuel III, who would reign for 46 years, longer than any other Italian king, never reversed this decision, never returned to sleep in the palace his father had loved, even as he continued to own it, even as it remained technically a royal residence, and one wonders what the closed villa meant during those decades of abandonment, whether it stood as a reproach, whether its empty halls whispered accusations, whether the king, in his other palaces, ever thought about those 700 empty rooms in Monza and felt anything beyond the grief that had motivated his original abandonment, and perhaps he did not. For Victor Emmanuel III was a man of profound contradictions, short in stature, barely 5 feet tall, but possessed of an outsized sense of royal prerogative, intellectually curious but politically cautious to the point of paralysis, constitutionally bound to respect parliamentary government but willing to make decisions that would undermine Italian democracy at its foundations, and the greatest of these decisions, the choice that would ultimately doom not just his reign but his entire dynasty, came in October 1922 when Benito Mussolini, a former socialist-turned-fascist demagogue, organized his March on Rome, a theatrical piece of political theater in which thousands of black-shirt fascist militants converged on the capital to demand that Mussolini be appointed prime minister, and the king, who had the constitutional authority and military means to suppress this insurrection, who could have declared martial law, who could have arrested Mussolini and his followers for sedition, instead hesitated, calculated, worried about civil war, worried about his own legitimacy, worried about choosing wrongly. And in the end invited Mussolini to form a government, a decision that historians have debated endlessly but which contemporary observers immediately recognized as catastrophic, a moment when constitutional monarchy revealed itself unwilling to defend constitutional government, and what followed over the next 2 decades. The gradual transformation of Italy from a parliamentary monarchy into a fascist dictatorship, the suppression of opposition parties, the curtailing of press freedom, the creation of a totalitarian state apparatus, the colonial wars in Africa conducted with spectacular brutality, the alliance with Nazi Germany, the anti-Semitic racial laws of 1938, and finally the disastrous entry into World War II, occurred with Victor Emmanuel's complicity, sometimes active, more often passive, the complicity of a man who convinced himself that he was preserving the monarchy by accommodating fascism, who believed that Mussolini could be controlled, that the worst excesses could be moderated, that by remaining on the throne he was preventing something even worse, and all the while the Villa Real in Monza stood closed, a silent witness to these betrayals, and during the war years, after Italy's catastrophic defeats in North Africa and the Soviet Union, after the Allied invasion of Sicily in 1943, Victor Emmanuel finally acted, joining a conspiracy to dismiss Mussolini, to arrest the dictator, to negotiate an armistice with the Allies, but this belated assertion of authority came too late to redeem the monarchy's reputation, for the king's flight from Rome as German troops occupied the capital, his abandonment of the city to Nazi control, his establishment of a shadow government in the south while Italy was torn apart by civil war between Mussolini's rump Italian Social Republic in the north, the German occupiers, and the partisan resistance. All of this revealed the fundamental moral bankruptcy of the Savoy monarchy, demonstrated that the dynasty had survived this long only through compromises and accommodations that left it bereft of legitimacy. And when the war finally ended in 1945, when Italy lay in ruins, when hundreds of thousands were dead, when the complicity of the monarchy with fascism was undeniable, the question arose, did Italy need a king at all? Did the House of Savoy deserve to continue ruling? could a dynasty so compromised possibly represent a democratic future? And Victor Emmanuel, in a last desperate attempt to save his family's throne, abdicated in May 1946 in favor of his son Umberto, hoping that a new king, unburdened by his father's choices, might win popular support. But this transparent manipulation convinced no one, and when on June 2, 1946, Italians voted in a referendum to choose between monarchy and republic, they chose republic by 54%, effectively voting the Savoys into exile, and Umberto II, who had been king for exactly 34 days, departed for Portugal carrying only a handful of personal possessions, and the Italian constitution was subsequently amended to ban all male members of the House of Savoy from ever returning to Italian soil, a prohibition that would last until 2002, and with this vote, with this exile, the Villa Real in Monza lost not just its royal residence but its entire reason for existence. For what purpose does a palace serve when there are no royals to inhabit it? What meaning does architectural splendor possess when the social order it was designed to represent has been voted into oblivion, and in 1934, even before the final collapse, Victor Emmanuel III had begun to divest himself of the property, donating most of the villa to the municipalities of Monza and Milan while retaining only the southern wing containing his father Umberto I's apartments, keeping these rooms closed, sealed, maintained as a kind of shrine to the murdered king. And this fragmentation of ownership, part state property, part municipal property, different wings administered by different bureaucracies, ensured that for decades after 1946 the Villa Real existed in a kind of administrative limbo, no single entity possessing the authority or resources to properly maintain the vast complex, and the palace that had survived the transition from Habsburg to French to Habsburg to Savoy ownership, that had witnessed three different political orders, began finally to deteriorate not from violence or revolution but from simple bureaucratic dysfunction, from lack of funds, from the complexity of coordinating restoration efforts across multiple jurisdictions, from the basic problem that Republican Italy, still processing its fascist trauma, still constructing a new democratic identity, didn't quite know what to do with the architectural legacy of the monarchy it had rejected, and so the Villa Real stood, its neoclassical facade slowly crumbling, its gardens slowly reverting to wilderness, its 700 rooms accumulating dust and water damage, its historical significance acknowledged in theory but neglected in practice, and for decades it was possible to visit the park, to walk along its paths, to glimpse the palace's facade, but the interior remained largely closed, inaccessible, a sealed box containing layers of history that no one seemed quite ready to confront, and this abandonment, this benign neglect, posed a question that went far beyond the fate of one building. What should democratic societies do with the architectural legacy of rejected political orders? How should republics treat the palaces of deposed monarchies? What responsibility do we have to preserve buildings whose original purpose we have repudiated? And Italy's answer, for many decades, was to simply defer the question, to leave the Villa Real in its limbo state, neither properly preserved nor deliberately destroyed, neither fully public nor entirely abandoned, a ghost palace haunting the outskirts of Monza. And this might have continued indefinitely had not a gradual shift occurred in Italian historical consciousness, a growing recognition that the traumatic events of the 20th century, fascism, war, the fall of the monarchy, needed to be studied, understood, processed rather than simply repressed, and beginning in the 1990s and accelerating in the 2000s, historians began to seriously excavate the Villa Real's past, to explore its archives, to recover the human stories embedded in its architecture, and what they discovered was simultaneously mundane and revelatory. Detailed records of the palace's construction showing the names and wages of workers whose labor had been erased from official histories, account books recording the vast expenses required to maintain 700 rooms, staff rosters revealing the hierarchical structure of palace life with its rigid separation between the visible performance of aristocratic ease and the invisible labor of hundreds of servants working below stairs and behind walls, personal letters from Umberto and Margherita providing intimate glimpses of their marriage and their feelings about royal duty, photographs documenting how the palace had been used during different periods, and slowly, through patient archival work, the Villa Real ceased to be merely an architectural monument and became instead a historical document, a three-dimensional text that could be read to understand not just the lives of kings and queens but the entire social system that had supported them, the vast invisible infrastructure of labor and expenditure required to maintain the illusion of effortless royal grandeur. And this scholarly work finally provided the impetus for proper restoration. 4. In 2012 a consortium of governmental entities, the Italian state, the Lombardy region, the municipalities of Monza and Milan, agreed to coordinate a massive restoration project, to stabilize the structure, restore the decorative arts, renovate the gardens, and most importantly to open the palace to the public as a historical museum. A space where Italians could confront this ambiguous legacy, could walk through rooms where kings had slept and queens had entertained, could see both the splendor and the underlying mechanisms of power, could recognize that the Villa Real's history was not separate from Italy's history but deeply embedded within it, and when the palace finally reopened to visitors in 2014, it stood not as a monument to royal glory but as a more complex historical witness. A building that had seen Habsburg absolutism give way to Napoleonic imperialism, give way to restored Austrian authority, give way to Italian unification, give way to constitutional monarchy, give way to fascist complicity, give way to republican rejection, a structure that had been built to communicate power's permanence but whose ultimate lesson was about power's transience, about the way political orders that seem eternal can vanish within a generation, about the speed with which magnificent architecture can become obsolete when the social relationships it was designed to encode are suddenly repudiated. And visitors today, walking through the restored apartments of Umberto and Margherita, can see rooms that still contain some of their original furnishings, can admire the neoclassical restraint of Piermarine's design, can wander through Canonica's additions, can stroll in the vast park that once hosted royal hunts, can marvel at the technical achievement of creating such a massive complex in only 3 years, can appreciate the artistry of Albertalli's stucco work and Maggiolini's marquetry. But they can also sense the absence, the fundamental emptiness at the heart of a palace that no longer serves its intended purpose, can feel the melancholy of rooms designed for kings in a country that no longer has them, can perceive the way architecture intended to be permanent became suddenly historical, frozen at the moment of abandonment, and perhaps the most poignant spaces are those apartments that Victor Emmanuel III kept sealed, the southern wing that contained his father's rooms, that he could never bear to enter after that July night in 1900, rooms that remained closed for decades, that preserved like a time capsule the decorative choices and personal possessions of a murdered king, rooms that finally when opened revealed not the grand historical narrative of royal power but something more intimate and painful, the ordinary objects of daily life, the personal effects of a man who had happened to be king, whose status provided no protection against an anarchist's bullet, whose death would haunt his son for 46 years and ultimately contribute to the dynasty's collapse. For who can say how Italian history might have unfolded differently? If Umberto I had not been assassinated, if Victor Emmanuel III had not been traumatized, if the Villa Real had remained a vibrant center of royal life rather than a sealed monument to grief, if the monarchy had maintained its connection to Monza, to Lombardy, to the industrial heart of Italy, rather than retreating into the isolation that would make its accommodation with fascism easier, its moral authority more tenuous, its ultimate rejection more complete, but history admits no counterfactuals, only the record of what happened, the trace of what was, and what remains in Monza is a palace that has outlived its purpose, that has been preserved not because Italians love monarchy, they decisively rejected it in 1946 and have never seriously reconsidered, but because the building itself has aesthetic merit, historical significance, and because even in a republic the architectural legacy of monarchy deserves preservation, not as a celebration of the political order it represented but as evidence of how people once lived, how power once operated, how an entire social system materialized itself in rooms and gardens and hunting parks, and the Villa Real today functions as a kind of three-dimensional history lesson, teaching through architecture what written texts alone cannot convey about the material reality of royal life, about the resources consumed, the labor exploited, the symbolic systems deployed, about the gap between the public performance of monarchy and its private reality, about the speed with which political certainties can evaporate, and about the strange fate of buildings designed for permanence that must instead adapt to impermanence, that must find new meanings, new uses, new justifications for their continued existence in a world that has moved beyond their original purpose, and perhaps this is the ultimate lesson of Italy's abandoned hunting palace. Not that the Savoy dynasty fell, dynasties always fall eventually, but that the architecture they built, the spaces they created, the material culture they commissioned, continues to exist after them, outliving their power, outlasting their legitimacy, bearing witness to their choices and their failures, serving in their absence as a monument not to their glory but to the fundamental impermanence of all political orders, to the way marble facades and neoclassical symmetry provide no protection against historical change, to the truth that palaces built to last forever become museums within a century, and that the hunting lodge where kings once pursued deer through carefully managed forests is now a public park where anyone can walk, where the hierarchies encoded in architecture have been democratized, where the spaces once reserved for royalty are now available to all, where the very existence of the building as museum rather than residence represents a kind of victory for the republican principle that rejected monarchy, and yet there is melancholy in this victory, for the Villa Real even in its restoration remains somehow empty, remains a palace without a purpose, remains a hunting lodge where no one hunts, a royal residence with no royals, a monument to a future that never arrived, for when Maria Theresa commissioned this building in 1777 she imagined it would house generations of Habsburg administrators. When Beauharnais expanded it he envisioned a permanent French presence in Italy, when Umberto and Margherita modernized it they assumed their descendants would summer here for centuries to come, and all these imagined futures collapsed, revealed themselves as illusions, and what remains is simply the building itself, beautiful, historically significant, carefully restored, open to the public, no longer abandoned in a physical sense but perhaps permanently abandoned in a deeper sense, forever severed from its original purpose, forever marked by the assassination that occurred outside its gates on that July evening in 1900. Forever haunted by the king who closed it in grief and never returned, forever implicated in the choices that destroyed the dynasty that owned it, and so the Villa Real of Monza stands today as both a triumph of preservation and a monument to loss, as evidence that beautiful architecture can outlive the political systems that created it, that palaces can become museums, that royal hunting parks can become public spaces, and that the material legacy of rejected regimes poses questions for democracies that are never fully resolved. How to preserve without celebrating, how to remember without endorsing, how to maintain historical consciousness without nostalgia, how to transform the architecture of privilege into spaces of public education, and these questions have no final answers but only provisional responses, choices made and remade by each generation about what to do with the abandoned palaces of the past, and in Monza the choice has been to restore, to preserve, to open, to interpret, to acknowledge the complexity of this legacy, to recognize that the Villa Real's history is inseparable from the larger history of Italy, that the choices made within its walls and by those who owned it reverberate through Italian history, that the palace abandoned after assassination and closed after dynastic collapse has lessons to teach about power and its limits, about the material requirements of monarchy, about the speed with which seemingly permanent institutions can vanish, and about the haunting persistence of architecture that outlives the purposes for which it was built, standing empty yet full of meaning, abandoned yet preserved, a hunting palace where no one hunts, a royal residence with no royals, a monument simultaneously to the ambitions of those who built it and the failure of everything they imagined it would represent, and perhaps this is the fitting end for the tragic story of Italy's Savoy Dynasty, not a living throne but an empty palace, not continuing power but historical memory, not a dynasty ruling but a dynasty remembered, their hunting lodge transformed from symbol of authority into museum of abandonment, their architectural legacy preserved precisely because the political order it represented has been so decisively repudiated that it poses no threat, can be studied safely, can be visited without danger of restoration, can stand as permanent evidence that monarchies fall, that dynasties end, that buildings commissioned to celebrate power become testaments to its transience, and that the Villa Real of Monza, conceived in Habsburg confidence, expanded in Napoleonic ambition, gifted in Savoy optimism, abandoned in royal grief, closed in dynastic collapse, fragmented in bureaucratic dysfunction, and finally restored in republican historical consciousness, tells in its architecture and its emptiness a story more complete than any written history could provide about the rise and fall of Italy's royal house, about the way violence can transform beloved places into sites too painful to inhabit, about how dynasties destroy themselves through moral compromise and political cowardice, about how buildings designed to last forever can become obsolete within decades, and about how the abandoned hunting palaces of deposed kings, standing empty in their carefully maintained gardens, their 700 rooms echoing with the footsteps only of tourists and scholars, become in their very abandonment the most eloquent monuments to the democratic principle that no family has a divine right to rule, that palaces are not destiny, that architecture cannot guarantee authority, and that the grandest hunting lodges of Europe's oldest dynasties can become, when the dynasty falls and the hunting ends, simply museums where ordinary citizens can walk through rooms once reserved for kings and queens and understand through the emptiness, through the absence, through the silence of corridors that once rang with royal voices, that all power is temporary, all dynasties mortal, all thrones eventually empty, and all the magnificent architecture commissioned to celebrate eternal authority becomes, given sufficient time and sufficient historical upheaval, merely beautiful buildings haunted by the ghosts of systems that no longer exist, purposes that no longer obtain, futures that never arrived, standing in their restored splendor as monuments not to what was achieved but to what was lost, not to successful dynasties but to failed ones, not to the permanence of power but to its inevitable dissolution, and that is perhaps the truest tragedy of the Villa Real. Not that it was abandoned, all palaces are eventually abandoned, but that it was abandoned so suddenly, so completely, so irrevocably, that a single night of violence could transform a summer retreat into a place too painful for a traumatized king to ever visit again, that the compromises and cowardices of one 46-year reign could doom an entire dynasty, that the Republican referendum of 1946 could exile forever the family that had unified Italy, that the hunting palace could become a museum within living memory of those who had hunted there, that the transition from active royal residence to historical artifact could occur with such brutal speed, telescoping what might have been a gradual centuries-long decline into a sudden 50-year collapse, and leaving behind this strange, beautiful, melancholy monument on the outskirts of Monza, a neoclassical palace that 3 different royal houses had called home, that Napoleon's stepson had expanded, that a murdered king had loved, that a traumatized son had closed, that a fallen dynasty had abandoned, that a republic hesitantly preserved, and that now stands open to anyone willing to pay the admission fee, walk through the restored rooms, stroll in the vast park, and contemplate the strange fate of buildings that outlive their builders' dreams, and yet to stand today in the entrance courtyard of the Villa Real, to look up at Piemonte's elegant facades with their restrained neoclassical ornament, to observe how the late afternoon sun casts shadows across the ochre walls and highlights the mathematical precision of the window arrangements, is to confront a paradox that haunts all abandoned royal residences. They are simultaneously more and less than they were designed to be, for the Villa Real was never intended to be merely beautiful architecture, never meant to function as an aesthetic object divorced from its social purpose, but rather was conceived as an instrument of power, a machine for producing and reproducing royal authority through the choreography of space, the control of access. The gradations of magnificence that marked the progress from public courtyard to semi-private reception rooms to intimate royal apartments, each threshold communicating something about hierarchy, about who could enter and who must wait, about the careful calibration of privilege that made monarchy function as a social system, and when this machinery of power ceased to operate, when the rooms emptied and the hierarchies dissolved and the carefully maintained boundaries between royal and non-royal space collapsed, the building became something else entirely, not a functioning palace but a representation of a palace, not an active instrument of governance but a historical exhibit about how governance once worked, and this transformation from living organism to preserved specimen fundamentally alters what the architecture means. For tourists and scholars walking through the Villa Real today experience these spaces in ways that would have been unthinkable to their original inhabitants, moving freely through rooms where access was once rigidly controlled, photographing details that servants would have been forbidden to gaze upon, lingering in doorways where courtiers once anxiously waited for royal acknowledgement, and this democratic access, this freedom to wander and observe and interpret without regard for the social protocols that once governed every movement through these corridors, represents a kind of posthumous revenge upon the building's original purpose, a negation through preservation of everything the architecture was meant to accomplish, and yet there is something troubling in this too, for the very act of transforming the Villa Real into a museum, of carefully restoring its decorative elements, of maintaining its gardens, of producing guidebooks and conducting tours, risks domesticating its history, making palatable and consumable a legacy that should perhaps be more disturbing, more challenging, more difficult to integrate into comfortable narratives about heritage and cultural patrimony, for this palace, beautiful as it is, was built and maintained Through the extraction of resources from people who had no choice in the matter, through tax systems that impoverished peasants to enrich aristocrats, through labor arrangements that exploited workers whose names we don't even know, through a social order premised on the idea that some families were inherently superior to others, inherently entitled to live in 700-room palaces while others lived in one-room cottages, inherently deserving of leisure and culture and comfort while others worked dawn to dusk in fields and factories, and the neoclassical beauty of Pirmorini's design, the artistic achievement of Albertalli's stucco work, the technical sophistication of the building's construction should not blind us to these uncomfortable truths, should not allow us to appreciate the architecture without acknowledging the human cost it represented. The vast expenditure of resources on a building whose primary purpose was to make visible the power of people whose claim to power rested ultimately on nothing more substantial than inherited privilege and military force, and this becomes particularly acute when we consider the Savoy period, when we remember that the family who inherited this palace, who modernized and cherished it, who abandoned it in grief, was the same family that collaborated with fascism, that signed the racial laws, that presided over Italy's disastrous colonial wars in Africa conducted with poison gas and aerial bombardment against civilian populations, that remained on the throne while Italy descended into dictatorship and then into catastrophic world war, and the Villa Real, closed during most of this period, shuttered as a monument to private royal grief, became in its very abandonment a symbol of the monarchy's retreat from responsibility, its inability or unwillingness to engage with the catastrophic choices being made in its name, its preference for mourning past violence rather than preventing future atrocities, and so. When we walk through the restored apartments of Umberto I and Margherita of Savoy, when we admire the period furnishings and the elegant proportions of the rooms, when we read the historical plaques describing their lives and their modernization of the palace, we must also remember what came after, must hold in our minds the knowledge that their son and heir would make choices that delegitimized the entire dynasty, would close this palace not just physically but morally, would transform it from a symbol of royal continuity into evidence of royal failure, and perhaps this is why the Villa Real remains, even in its restoration, somehow melancholy, somehow haunted, for it is impossible to separate the aesthetic achievement of the building from the moral failures of those who owned it, impossible to appreciate the architectural sophistication without acknowledging the political bankruptcy, impossible to walk these halls without sensing the weight of all the abandoned futures, all the imagined continuities that never materialized, all the royal children who would have inherited this palace but instead died in exile, stateless, their titles mere courtesy forms with no legal force, their claim to crowns that no longer exist, and the Villa Real stands as monument to their dispossession, as architectural proof that political orders we imagine to be permanent are in fact contingent, fragile, vulnerable to sudden collapse when they lose moral authority, and the moral authority of the Italian monarchy, compromised by collaboration with fascism, destroyed by flight and abdication, was so thoroughly discredited by 1946 that 54% of Italians, many of whom had grown up under royal rule, many of whom had no experience of republican government, nevertheless voted to abolish the institution entirely, to exile the royal family, to repudiate not just a particular king but the principle of monarchy itself, and this repudiation, this democratic rejection, gives the Villa Real its current meaning, transforms it from palace to museum, from active symbol to historical artifact, from instrument of power to evidence about power, and in this transformation there is both loss and gain, for we lose the experience of the building as it was meant to be experienced, as a functioning palace with its protocols and hierarchies and daily rhythms of royal life, but we gain the ability to see it more clearly, to understand its mechanisms without being subject to them, to appreciate its architecture while critiquing its purpose, to preserve its beauty while rejecting its politics, and this is perhaps the greatest achievement of the Villa Real's restoration, not that it has returned the building to some imagined original state, but that it has made visible the gap between past and present, has made tangible the distance between the world that built these rooms and the world that now visits them, has created a space where Italians can confront their complicated relationship with monarchy, can acknowledge both the genuine achievements and the profound failures of the Savoy Dynasty, can recognize that their national unification, their emergence as a modern state, occurred under royal leadership but that the monarchy ultimately betrayed the nation it had helped create, and that the Villa Real, in its beauty and its emptiness, in its careful preservation and its fundamental abandonment of original purpose, tells this complicated story more completely than any historical text could. For architecture, when it outlives its creators and their intentions, becomes a kind of unintentional archive, preserving in three dimensions not just the aspirations of those who built it but the ways those aspirations were thwarted, not just the power of those who inhabited it but the limitations of that power, not just the grandeur of royal life but its ultimate unsustainability, its dependence on social arrangements that modern democracy has rejected. And so the visitor leaving the Villa Real today, emerging from its restored interiors into the vast park where deer still graze in meadows once reserved for royal hunts, where joggers and cyclists now traverse paths where kings once rode, where families picnic on lawns once carefully manicured by armies of gardeners serving aristocratic pleasure, carries away not just memories of beautiful rooms and elegant architecture but a more profound understanding of how quickly and completely political orders can change, how buildings designed to celebrate power become monuments to its passing, how palaces become museums, and hunting parks become public spaces and royal residences become tourist destinations, and how in all these transformations there is both melancholy and justice, loss and liberation, the sadness of abandoned grandeur and the triumph of democratic access, and the Villa Real of Monza, standing on the outskirts of that modest industrial city, its neoclassical facades glowing in the evening light, its 700 rooms open now to anyone willing to climb its stairs and walk its corridors, its gardens no longer exclusive but inclusive, its history no longer hidden but interpreted, serves as permanent reminder that the Savoy dynasty's tragic end was not tragedy in the classical sense, not the fall of great people through fate or flaw alone, but something more complex and more modern, the collapse of an entire social order whose time had passed, whose claims to legitimacy could not survive its moral compromises, whose architectural legacy survives precisely because the political system it represented has been so completely superseded, and in this there is perhaps a final lesson, that the most magnificent hunting palaces of deposed dynasties become, in their transformation into museums and public parks, monuments not to the permanence of power but to the possibility of change, not to the inevitability of hierarchy but to its contingency, not to the divine right of kings but to the democratic right of peoples to choose their own governance, to reject dynasties that fail them, to transform exclusive spaces into common heritage, and to preserve the architecture of rejected political orders not as shrines to what was lost but as educational spaces where each generation can learn anew that power is temporary, that buildings outlast the purposes for which they were built, and that the abandoned hunting palaces of Italy's last king stand now as beautiful, melancholy, and ultimately hopeful reminders that no throne is permanent, no dynasty immortal, and no palace so grand that it cannot become, when historical circumstances demand it, simply another museum where ordinary people walk through extraordinary rooms and understand through their very access, through their freedom to wander spaces once forbidden to their ancestors, that the tragic end of Italy's Savoy dynasty was also, paradoxically, a beginning, the opening of closed doors, the democratization of exclusive spaces, and the transformation of a hunting palace built for kings into a monument accessible to all, where the emptiness speaks louder than any royal presence ever could, where absence has become the deepest form of meaning, and where the silence of 700 rooms tells the complete story of a dynasty that unified a nation, compromised with dictatorship, fled in defeat, died in exile, and left behind only beautiful buildings that stand now as architectural witnesses to the fundamental impermanence of all power, the inevitable collapse of all dynasties, and the strange persistence of beauty in the ruins of rejected political dreams.